Okay, good morning all. The last time, in the last Wednesday's class, we looked at the certificate authorities and we learned that they perform the function of linking one's identity to a certain public key. Because the problem was that if you request a public key from the owner of the signature, any attacker can insert their own public key and claim that this is the public key of the claimed source, and then the verification of the signature will still pass. It will still be verified because you will be using the public key of the attacker, and you will be using the public key of the attacker to verify the signature of the attacker. But with the certificate authorities, we learned that these authorities are trusted and they can establish that linkage between one's public key and one's identity, and that cannot be fooled. And today we are going to be looking at another way of authentication, which we call endpoint authentication, and it is the process of one entity proving its identity to another entity in a live communication. So the difference is like this. So in digital signatures, let's say, we still have endpoint authentication. We still have authentication, but the liveliness of the communication is not guaranteed. Let's say this is my message. In a digital signature, this is what I do, right? I take the hash of that, and I also encrypt that with my private key. And then I send this to my destination. And because my destination obtained K+, which is my public key from a certificate authority, they can verify that this message M is authentic. It is coming indeed from me. And it hasn't been changed in transit. This is what we learned in message integrity and authentication, in other words, message authentication. But one problem with that is an attacker can just record this whole thing, and send this tomorrow, or 5 days later, or next year. So let's say this message is, meet me at the cafe at 5 p.m., and I sent this message today. I meant today, 5 p.m. But let's say the attacker recorded this message and the signature, and they sent it 7 days later to my friend. Then my friend will verify this K minus H of M with my public key, and this verification will pass. But the problem is, I meant meeting 7 days earlier, but because this verification now passes, they have no way of identifying whether my message is fresh, whether it is live or not. So this is what endpoint authentication does. We are focusing here on authentication during live communication at the time of communication, okay? So a concrete example here would be a user authenticating herself to a mail server, claiming I am the mail client, Alice, let's say, and please send me the emails that are in my inbox, that are in my mail server dedicated to my username. So one problem with the same example, a problem with the earlier example, similar to the earlier example, could be an attacker can just record that Alice's claim that she is Alice. Perhaps Alice sent a digital signature like this one, with the message being, give me my messages. If the attacker records this one, they can just replay this at a later time, claiming to be Alice and reading Alice's emails. Okay, so this is a little bit of a different problem than proving that a message is received at some point in the past did indeed come from that claim sender. So now we are going to be going over several scenarios for endpoint authentication. And I want you to think about whether the scheme works, or if it is flawed, what is the flaw? So the first scenario is very simple. So Alice is our sender, here, and Bob is our receiver, and we have our attacker Trudy, which tries to mess up with the messages that Bob receives. She will claim that the messages come from Alice, while indeed they were planted there by Trudy. So the first scenario is very simple. Alice says, "I am Alice." And do you think Bob should believe in this case? Well, obviously not. This even fails the message authentication, let alone the endpoint authentication, live authentication. Well, in a network, Bob cannot see Alice. It cannot see the sound coming from her. So anyone can claim that they are Alice. So here, Trudy just claims that she is Alice. And because Bob cannot see her, he has to believe if this is your protocol. So this is the protocol AP1, the authentication protocol 1. It is a very simplistic version, and it clearly doesn't work. Well, perhaps we can improve on this by adding Alice's IP address into the message. So now Alice says, "I am Alice," but also she attaches her IP address in the message, in the application layer message. What do you think can go wrong here? Can Trudy impersonate Alice in this case because, she has a different IP address apparently? Well, yes, Trudy has a different IP address, but she can spoof her IP by accessing the operating system code. Remember, the IP address is added by the operating system. You don't add it by coding. But if she's doing low-level programming, she can access the operating system code. She can compile the operating system. She can attach any IP address she wants into the messages. And if this is in the application layer, that is very easy, right? You just add that IP address in your message. But if we want our destination to look at the network layer IP header, then even that can be spoofed by playing with the operating system code. So this way, Trudy can just send a false IP datagram with the IP address of Alice. So this also doesn't work. So let's say now in the application, in the authentication protocol 3, Alice says, "I'm Alice," as always. She sends her IP address, but she also sends her password. This is just like a password you use to access any web server, any account, any application, whatever. Just some password that only Alice and Bob knows, but no one else knows. What can go wrong here? So apparently pretty much all these services using accounts like Gmail, Google, Facebook, they all use passwords, but they don't use it this way. So one failure scenario here is that, well, if Alice sends her password in plain text just like this, well, Trudy will know Alice's password by listening to Alice's messages, by intercepting Alice's messages. In other words, eavesdropping Alice's messages, right? We didn't add any confidentiality to it. So anytime she wishes, then Trudy can replay Alice's message. That's for one thing. Or she can just replace this message, "I am Alice," with anything else. "I am Alice, meet me at the cafe at 7 p.m. today." And then sends the same password that Alice used. And we already learned how IP address can be spoofed. So everything in Alice's message can be spoofed. It doesn't even provide message authentication, let alone proving the liveliness of the communication. So how can we improve on that? Well, one problem with this was that the password was sent in plain text, and that can be eavesdropped and that can be recorded by the attacker. So an intuition could be here that let's encrypt the password then. So Alice sends the message, I am Alice, her IP address, and the encrypted password, so that nobody can decipher what the password is. Well, does it work? Well, apparently, Trudy here can still record that message with the encrypted password, and she can use that encrypted password for the future messages, just like Alice did. She doesn't even have to know the password. She can just use encrypted password because that is what Bob is expecting. So Trudy can just put any message here. It doesn't even have to be I am Alice. So this thing doesn't even provide message authentication. I can give any message to Bob and claim that it is coming from Alice because apparently I know the encrypted password, which Bob will verify. And of course, I can, as always, attach Alice's IP address. This doesn't even add anything. So using cryptography this way here did not solve our endpoint authentication problem, because Bob is subject to what we call a playback attack. So this is sometimes called a replay attack. But this is not the only attack Bob is subjected to, because this is that Trudy here did not have to repeat the message, I am Alice. She could just send any other message. So this is not secure against endpoint authentication. This is not secure against message authentication. In other words, message authentication was integrity plus authentication, right? So this is not secure against any of it. So let's give it another try, but this time a better try. So our goal is to avoid the playback attack, definitely. And we want Alice to use some number that is used only once in a lifetime, only during that point in time, so that if that number is repeated in a future time, in a future sequence of exchange, Bob will know. Perhaps Bob can give Alice that number for Alice to prove that she is live during the communication, and then she is acting on that with something that only she knows, or only she and Bob shares. So here our authentication protocol will prove that Alice is live. So in our protocol, Bob will send Alice nonce, a number that is used only once in a lifetime. And Alice must return R added with something of her own, or something that she shares with Bob. So let's see what happens here. So we have a few steps this time. It's not Alice sending something and then immediately Bob knows that this is Alice. Let's say somebody claims Bob that they are Alice. Bob doesn't know if this message is coming from Alice or Trudy, or anyone else for that matter. Then Bob will say, okay, you want me to believe that you are Alice. If you are Alice, let's encrypt this R, this nonce, with your key, with the shared secret key we have. And then Alice will encrypt this R using the shared key of Alice and Bob. So that means, because KAB is only known by Alice and Bob, but not Trudy, then this means this has to be Alice, but no one else. Well, let's say Trudy comes later. She can record this, right? She can do the playback. And sometime later, she sent the same message. Bob will not process this. Why? Because he didn't even send R this time. If Trudy comes there and claims that Trudy that she is Alice, well, Bob will send her another nonce, let's say R prime, And what he will be expecting will be KAB of R prime, which Trudy cannot generate. If Trudy sends KAB of R, this will fail the verification. So the key point here is that the protocol has something that is used only once in a lifetime and only during that instance of communication, only in that session. And if it is used in some other time, it will fail the verification. So let's now, this one uses shared symmetric keys. But we also learned that in the internet, you don't de facto have the shared symmetric keys, but you can obtain the public key of the other party from a certificate authority. So let's try to do this, apply the same concept of using nonces and encrypting nonces using public key cryptography, because we may not have shared symmetric keys all the time. So can we authenticate using public key techniques? And our authentication protocol 5 aims to do this. So Alice says, I'm Alice, again, to Bob. And then Bob will send a nonce, very similarly. But the only difference now is that Alice will encrypt R using her private key. And because Bob knows that this private key is possessed only by Alice, when he verifies this with KA plus, this way, if he can obtain R, he will know that the other party is indeed Alice and she is live during the communication. She encrypted R during this session only after R is known to her. But as we learned, you must obtain KA minus from a certificate authority. If you do not do that, if you ask the other party to send their public key, and you attempt to verify that with public key, you will run into problems that we have seen earlier. We have learned that any adversary can just implant their own public key here, and they can just encrypt the nonce with their own private key so that this verification will still pass, but it will indeed be an attacker on the other side of communication. So in that case, in the case we do not use certificate authorities, let's see what can go wrong over this scenario. So we will be running an attack called man in the middle attack. So here Trudy, or woman in the middle attack. So Trudy is in the middle of Alice and Bob. She can intercept their messages. She can read their messages. And she can inject messages, or she can tamper with their messages. So this is a very dangerous method of attack, and it is very hard to prevent unless you use perfect practices of cryptography. So let's see what can go wrong if you do not use certificate authorities to obtain the public keys. So Alice claimed she's Alice. Well, Trudy will just reply that to Bob. She intercepted that message because she sits on the communication channel. And then by the same protocol, Bob will ask Trudy to encrypt a nonce, or Bob thinks this is Alice. Bob will send a nonce to Alice for her to encrypt it using her private key. But Trudy, being in the channel, in the middle, she will receive that nonce, and she will, in fact, encrypt it with her own private key, KT minus of R. So remember, Bob doesn't know KA plus yet, because he didn't contact certificate authority to do that. We do not have certificate authorities in this scenario. So later, he will ask for public keys. And, Trudy will just send her own public keys to Bob. And Trudy will repeat the same protocol as Bob with Alice. So she will send a nonce to Alice. And Alice will send that nonce encrypted with her own private key to Trudy. And Trudy will ask for her public key, just repeating the protocol here so that Alice doesn't suspect anything. And Alice will send her own public key. And, you know, the whole point of this endpoint authentication is to prove that the other entity is live and other entity is the claimed entity, right? So that we can start exchanging messages, just like with the mail server. You first authenticate yourself and that you are live, so that mail server can start sending you messages. So you can think of Bob here as the mail server, for instance. And then Bob will start sending the messages with confidentiality. How do we do that? We do that by encrypting the messages with the public keys of the receiving party, in this case, KT+, so that only Trudy can decipher these messages and obtain the message, but no one else can derive any meaning out of that ciphertext or compute any function of that ciphertext. That is what we learned in encryption. So, because Trudy possesses her own private key, obviously, she can compute M, so she can get the message from, let's say, the mail server. And she can send a fake message to Alice using Alice's public key. You know, so just so that Alice doesn't suspect anything, that Alice will think only I can decipher this, which is true, by the way, so that Alice obtains some message. And this message doesn't have to be the same message with this message. So in this scenario, Alice and Bob did not even communicate. It was all Trudy communicating with both. And this is very, very difficult to detect unless you obtain these public keys from a certificate authority. You do not ask for the public key from your receiver, from the party you're communicating with. So in this scenario, Bob received everything that Alice sends, and Alice received everything that Bob sends. So they do not suspect anything. For instance, they can meet 1 week later and recall the conversation. But the problem is, Trudy receives all the messages as well. So Bob thinks that this is KT plus of M is encrypted with Alice's public key, and that it is Alice on the other side of communication, whereas it is in fact Trudy who planted that public key and claims that this is Alice's public key. KT plus is in fact Alice's public key, whereas Trudy can in fact decipher that message. And even more dangerous is that, you know, Trudy doesn't have to send the correct message to Alice. She can just implant any message. She can implant a fake message. Or she can just modify this original message. So let's go back to this scenario again and think about fixing this. So the major problem here was that we obtained the public keys from the party we are communicating with, right? This KT plus and KA minus. So instead of doing that, if Bob, let's say, doesn't ask for Alice's public key, but obtains that from a certificate authority, such that, you know, this is Alice's public key, and this is ID of Alice, and here is my signature to prove that. And of course, together with that, the authority will have to send the same thing in the plain text form. So this is the message. In other words, the link between the Alice's identity and Alice's public key. And this is the signature by the certificate authority to prove that this link is authentic and it has not been tampered with. If Bob obtains this from a CA, then this kind of attack will not work, because then Trudy won't have a chance to implant her own public key here, and the verification of KT minus of R will fail, because Bob will attempt to decipher it with KA plus, which will fail. KA plus. Any questions? Okay. So one more point here is let's go back to this symmetric key based endpoint authentication scenario, where Alice claims she is Alice, Bob sends her a nonce, and then Alice encrypts that nonce with the shared symmetric key, right? So this works, but this assumes that Alice and Bob first shares a secret key, a shared key. But let's assume for the time being that they share a symmetric key. Only two of them knows that symmetric key, but no one else. And that symmetric key has sufficient length, sufficient security whatsoever. But this protocol has 3 steps in it, right? So it's like a 3-way handshake. Can we do this in just one step? Think about it. Can Alice prove that she is Alice without having to receive anything from Bob? And I want some answers here. It's not like you will go silent and I'll respond myself. I want some ideas at least. Even if they are wrong, we can improve on them. So let's give a little hint. So what Bob needed to send here is this nonce, which is once in a lifetime value. Think about this. So what once in a lifetime value I can use without having to receive that from Bob, and Bob cannot dispute it is once in a lifetime value. Exactly. That's good. So Alice, instead of receiving this, having to receive this, she can just send the whole timestamp. Let's say today is what day? 12/4/23, and the exact time of the day, it's 10:31. Let's say 45. If you want milliseconds, you can also add milliseconds here, depending on the granularity of your authentication. And if Alice sends this encrypted with the shared symmetric key, Bob will receive the same, and Bob will know the exact timestamp, or Alice, Alice can just, let's say this is TS, Alice can just attach this in the plain text form so that Bob can also check that. Bob will just decrypt this KAB with the KAB and see this timestamp, and then he will check if this timestamp is accurate. Is it the current time indeed, or is it the time of 5 hours earlier or yesterday? If it is the time of now, that means Alice sent this message just now, because only Alice knows KAB. But if it is a message 5 hours earlier, then perhaps Trudy Trudy recorded that 5 hours earlier when Alice sent it, and then she's replaying it now. Sorry, there is no TS here. She doesn't have to send TS in plain text form. She just sends KAB of the message and the timestamp. Or if the communication between them can keep states, they can use sequence numbers. But you can only do this under certain scenarios. Let's say every minute I send a message to the other party, so I can just add sequence numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for every day as my timestamp. So it doesn't have to be exact date and time like this, but it can be some kind of sequence numbers depending on the communication between us. So this is, in fact, typically how it is done. This is, we usually add timestamps. We do not usually encrypt the whole message like this if all we want to add is endpoint authentication. But what we typically do is this. So this is my message, right? Then we learned about message authentication codes. Then I add the hash of my message and our shared symmetric key, KAB. This was a message authentication code. And next to this, I attach a timestamp. So this is also message authentication code, but with a timestamp. So with this, I can add both message authentication, what we learned in the previous classes, and I can provide endpoint authentication, or the freshness to my messages. So I do not have to repeat all these 3 steps. I can just get away with this one. But of course, this assumes that you have knowledge of, you have established a shared symmetric key. Well, if you did not establish a shared symmetric key, then this is what you can do. You can just do the same with a digital signature. So this is your message, right? And with that message, you just add a signature computed with KA minus, H of M, and TS. Okay, so the right-hand side, let's color that. So this part is a digital signature, right? The only difference is that I now added the timestamp next to my message. And you also have the plain text message. And perhaps this time you need to attach the timestamp in plain text form so that, even if the receiver doesn't get the exact timestamp because of the granularity, very high precision of the timestamp, they may not have the same timestamp at the time they receive the message. So that you just attach the timestamp at the time of generating that message so that the receiver can verify using that TS. Any questions? Okay. All right, so now we are going to be looking at some of the applications that we use pretty much every day, namely securing email and the transport layer security that is used in the World Wide Web. So we are not going to be learning anything new in terms of cryptography, but we are going to learn the applications of some of the things some of the primitives that we learned. So we are going to be looking at all these hash functions, digital signatures, public key cryptography, message authentication codes, endpoint authentication, everything that we learned so far have applications in real life. And now we're going to be looking at those. So first is the secure email. Let's begin by addressing confidentiality in emails. So we learned that confidentiality is ensuring that no attacker, no one else but my intended receiver can compute any function of the message, right? So this is typically provided by encryption, encrypting using the shared symmetric key or encrypting using the public key of my receiver. But, in real life, you want to be as practical as possible. We want to use symmetric key cryptography as much as possible unless we have to use public key cryptography because that is simply more efficient, cheaper. So let's begin by addressing confidentiality. And the most straightforward way to do that is using symmetric key encryption. But there can be no shared key between the emailing users or a mail client and a mail server. So this is what happens. So this is our Alice, this is our Bob. And Alice wants to authenticate herself, perhaps to her mail server operated by Bob. So this is Alice's message. Maybe she's saying, I'm Alice, give me my last 5 emails, something like that. And Alice will just make up a shared key, KS. Bob doesn't know it yet, but Alice will share it with Bob securely. And she encrypts M with KS, so she obtained KS of M. So if Alice sends this KS of M immediately to Bob, Bob won't be able to decrypt it because he doesn't know KS. So together with this KS of M, this is what Alice does. She encrypts KS with Bob's public key, which Alice obtained from a certificate authority of Bob. So she has KB plus of KS. So if you think about it, when we encrypt with the public key of the receiver, no one else other than our intended receiver can decipher this. In fact, can compute any function of KS out of this. So if I send this to Bob, Bob will be securely obtain KS, and no one else will know KS. So Alice sends both KS of M and KB plus of KS to Bob. Here. So what did we do overall? Alice created a random symmetric private key, KS, which we discussed here. She encrypted the message with KS for efficiency. Why do we say for efficiency? Well, because, Alice could have just encrypted the message with Bob's public key and sent this to Bob, and only Bob will be able to decrypt this and obtain M. This also provides confidentiality, yes. But if your message is long, let's say Alice sends a huge document, maybe she wants to send an email, and that is a huge document of JPEG images, zip files, compressed files, 20 megabytes of stuff. If you use public key cryptography on that, let's say you use RSA, and you do modular exponentiation of that massive message, it takes a lot of computing power. You don't want to do that. So this protocol is developed in a way to minimize computation for both parties. So that is why we do not use public key cryptography directly on the message, but we now only encrypt M with the symmetric key and provide that symmetric key to the other party by using public key cryptography. So this symmetric key, if this is An AES key, for instance, it is a small key, for instance, 256 bits or 512 bits. That is fixed in size, so it can be much more easily, at least, encrypted and decrypted using public key cryptography. So Alice encrypted KS with Bob's public key right here, and she sent both KS of M and KB plus of KS to Bob. So now let's see what Bob does. Bob obtained both KS of M and KB plus of KS. So all he wants to obtain is M. That is the objective of Bob. But he doesn't know KS. So first he needs to obtain KS. So this is what he does. He just decrypts this with his own private key, and he obtains KS from there, and he uses this KS to decrypt KS of M and obtain M from there. Again, if Alice had used her, if Alice used public key cryptography, in other words, if she encrypted the message using Bob's public key, this is also hard on Bob to decrypt it, because now he needs to use public key cryptography on this and obtain a rather long message out of this. So this is not preferred for both parties here. Okay, so this is just confidentiality. But in the email, we know that confidentiality is not the only property. We also want to add message authentication so that no one else can send emails on behalf of us and tamper with our emails. That is definitely not desirable, right? Someone receiving emails on behalf of you saying maybe swear words, or maybe just calling them for meetings, invites, but you do not show up. So we need to add integrity and message authentication to our emails as well. Any questions on confidentiality for emails? Okay. So Alice wants to provide source authentication and message integrity. In other words, message authentication. So this is how it is done. So this is our message. And Alice hashes it, and Alice encrypts it with her private key and obtains this. What is that? We learned that. It's a digital signature. Very simple. And of course, you need to add the message itself with digital signatures. So what Alice sends in the end is the message plus the signature for that message. Okay, that's very simple. This is directly the primitive we learned. So it is immediately applicable to integrity in emails, message integrity and authentication in the emails. And what Bob does is the same, same as verifying digital signatures. So he obtained this digital signature, and he will apply Alice's public key on this to obtain the digest. And he also obtained the message M, so he will hash that message to obtain the digest. And then he will compare if these two are equivalent, identical. If they are, then he knows that this message came from Alice and it has not been tampered with in transit. So this is immediately the digital signatures that we learned. Let's say now we want to provide also endpoint authentication, that the communication is live, because this digital signature perhaps is recorded by Trudy yesterday, and she also blocked the message so that Bob didn't receive that message yesterday. But now today, Trudy, perhaps, wanted to read Alice's emails or wants to send an email on behalf of Alice, the same message. So she can just send the same digital signature. She can replay it to Bob and claim that it is, in fact, Trudy on the other side of the communication. Well, to prevent that, again, we can just directly apply the timestamp method, for instance. We can put the timestamp here and compute the digital signature like so. Okay, so we learned separately how to provide confidentiality and how to provide message authentication to our emails. But what if we want to provide both, which is typically the case? Well, we simply combine the two block diagrams that we learned just now. So what we did for the digital signatures, Alice hashed that message, and Alice encrypted that digest using her private key and obtained the digital signature for the message M. And then she will concatenate these two, both the message and the signature. And then we are using our block diagram for the confidentiality. So she will apply a newly generated symmetric key, or shared key. This is not yet known by Bob, but it will be known soon. So she uses KS to encrypt both the message and the digital signature together, the concatenated message and the digital signature. So in other words, this is how it looks like in here. It's not written, so let me write. KS of KA minus H of M and M. Let's make these brackets. Like so. So because this is encrypted with a key which is only known by Alice for now and soon to be known by Bob, this cannot be deciphered by anyone other than Alice for now. And obviously, because Bob doesn't know KS yet, Alice will have to send KS securely, and for that, she uses Bob's public key to encrypt KS to obtain KB plus of KS. And she sends this and this to Bob through internet. And, I don't have a diagram for what Bob does, but what he does is, again, similarly applying these two block diagrams, the inverse of these two block diagrams, the right-hand side of what we learned, to obtain KS first from this by applying his own private key. And after obtaining KS, he will obtain this part by decrypting it, and then he will do the digital signature verification using Alice's public key. But again, one key point here is that Bob needs to obtain Alice's public key from a certificate authority. That has to be done. You cannot ask Alice, you cannot rely on Alice to send her public key to you, because apparently, as we learned, any attacker can just intercept and plant their own public key in the place of Alice's public key. So the common practice is to use certificate authority. So we still need to have trust somewhere, some trusted authority that we all know. So this is all about secure emails. Any questions? Okay, cool. So now we are going to be looking at an even more popular application, which is the TLS, Transport Layer Security, or in the deprecated name, the earlier name, the SSL, the Secure Socket Layer. And it can enhance the TCP services with confidentiality, message authentication, and endpoint authentication. And most web servers and browsers today use this. And this is, in fact, the S addition to HTTP. It is usually HTTPS, which stands for the Secure Socket Layer or Transport Layer Security in the current name. And in fact, most browsers today won't even allow you to connect non-HTTPS websites, just HTTP websites, or at least they will give out a warning to you. Because if you're connecting to an HTTP website, that means there is no security on top of TCP, and any password you are sharing with that website goes in plain text form. So from there, any attacker can just intercept your password. Anyone wiretapping your network, your internet service provider, anyone on the network and in one of these routers can in fact decipher your password and then use it later for their own purposes. So all the banks, all the social media websites, all the websites that have something to do with financials, where you enter credit card information or healthcare information, they all use transport layer security over TCP. Yeah, so it's supported by almost all browsers today and web servers. So these are the properties we learned. It provides confidentiality using symmetric encryption. Again, this is for efficiency. You can provide confidentiality using public key cryptography, but that is not efficient. So that's why we use symmetric key encryption. It provides integrity via cryptographic hashing, in other words, using the message authentication codes. And it provides message authentication and endpoint authentication using public key cryptography. So it has all the properties that we learned. There is no new cryptographic primitive there, again, similar to email. It only relies on things we discussed. There is no new crazy scheme. But it is structured in a way to use all these primitives in a smart way and in an efficient way. So it was, earlier internet didn't have any security before, but now that we have all these online banking applications, that we deal with accounts, that we deal with financial information, it's been developed as an extension to TCP later on. So the SSL or TLS today uses TCP services. So the earlier name of this was SSL, and it was deprecated in 2015. And again, this is also defined in the request for comments document, so it is public. It's nothing is secret about it. It is constantly improved. Perhaps over time, certain cryptographic schemes are proven unsecure under a small sliver of circumstances, perhaps. So it is constantly being improved to close all these security gaps. But it is pretty much a very well-known and widely deployed standard today. So TLS, in fact, secures HTTP in the web. But because TLS is actually employed on top of TCP. It can be used in any service that uses TCP. So it doesn't have to be HTTP. You can also use TLS in your secure mail application, your proprietary mail application, or you can use it in a video conferencing application. You can use TLS even if you do not use HTTP. Or you can use perhaps in a file transfer application, or some of the multimedia applications that we learned. You can use it perhaps with RTP. And one question arises then here, can we use it over UDP? Well, it is not typically used, but you can structure your application if you want to make it work with UDP. The problem with UDP is that, as we shall see now, SSL requires certain states among communicating parties, and it establishes a session between the communicating parties. And because UDP is connectionless, it is a bit difficult to do that. But if you build services on top of UDP to make it a more connection-oriented protocol, then you can perhaps use TLS on top of UDP. But the common practice is to use it over TCP. Again, if you want to use TLS, you do not read the RFC document and implement everything one by one on your own. Well, there are already APIs, application programmer interfaces, that extends the TCP sockets. So all a programmer needs to do in that case is to include those transport layer security or SSL libraries in their program. So this is where TCP socket is, right? So the sockets are the door between application and the transport layers. And SSL is right on top of TCP, and it employs the services of TCP. So it calls the TCP socket. It extends the TCP socket. So although it technically resides, this SSL or TLS technically resides in the in the application layer, from the developer's perspective, it is in the transport layer. It is a transport layer protocols because it extends TCP services with security. So what we are going to learn here is something that is very close to TLS, but not exactly is TLS. But just to give you some flavor of how it looks like, it is a little bit more complicated in practice. But we don't have to do that. We don't have to learn every bit of detail in that protocol. Just to get some ideas, some insights as to how it can make use of the primitives that we learned, the cryptographic primitives that we learned, to provide all these confidentiality, integrity, and message authentication in the World Wide Web, or any service that uses TCP for that matter. So our TLS has three phases: the handshake phase, key derivation phase, and the data transfer phase is already where our data is transferred. And below we have the handshake phase, and then I'm going to go through the key derivation phase. And data transfer is just the data transfer we learned earlier. So here is Bob, here is Alice. And what is this part? You already know this part. This is the TCP handshake, correct? Bob sends TCP SYN message, Alice replies with TCP SYN ACK, and Bob sends the TCP ACK. It's a three-way TCP handshake. So this goes on. That means a connection is established between Bob and Alice. So now the TLS stuff begins. So Bob wants to verify that Alice is really Alice. So to begin that, Bob will send an SSS hello message. This is just the initiation of the SSL to indicate that SSL handshake begins here. And sorry, SSL handshake is actually the whole thing here, but this is to indicate that Bob wants to establish an SSL connection or the TLS connection, or they want to use TLS-based TCP. And Alice will reply with her certificate. And what is a certificate? It is a certification by a certificate authority, let's say CA, that Alice's ID is linked to a certain public key. And of course, next to this, we have also the ID of Alice and public key of Alice, right? This is just the usual certificate that we learned before. Nothing is different. So from that certificate, Bob will then obtain KA+, and he will establish that this is indeed Alice's public key. No question on that. And then Bob will create this EMS, what we call the encrypted master secret, by making up an MS, a master secret. So this is something made up by Bob based on certain rules. But it has to be random. It has to be a secret from anyone. And Bob encrypts it with Alice's public key, which he just obtained from the certificate authority. Okay? So it's very simple so far. Alice sent her certificate. Bob verified that certificate and obtained Alice's public key and established that this is indeed Alice's public key. And then Bob created an encrypted master secret using Alice's public key from a master secret. And this master secret is, we're going to just learn about this master secret here. And then this process of master secret generation is the key derivation process. So let me just maybe draw something like a master secret. So this is the master secret Bob made up. And this master secret consists of 4 parts. It is basically some secret that contains all the keys that Bob and Alice will use throughout their TLS session. So it is established only once in the handshake phase, and in the key derivation phase, both of them will obtain that. Alice will also obtain that. And from there on in the data transfer phase, this master secret, these parts of this master secret will be used to add security functions into every message they have. So one way we could do this is to use a single key for everything, but then it is not secure to use the same key for multiple purposes. And also, different cryptographic schemes have different key lengths. For instance, AES has a smaller key length than RSA, or an HMAC has a smaller key length than ECDSA or AES, for instance. So instead of that, we have one large MS, which is partitioned into different keys, different cryptographic keys used for different purposes in the data transfer phase of this TLS session. So EB the first part, is the session encryption key for data sent from Bob to Alice. So if later, then in the data transfer phase, Bob wants to send a message to Alice, this is what he will do. Now this is the message, and this is EB, and Bob will just encrypt that message using EB. And EA is the same thing for Alice. So if Alice wants to send a message with confidentiality, this is what Alice will do. EA of M. And the reason we do not use the same keys, the same symmetric key for both ways of data transfer, is that, typically in practice, it is not a good practice to use the same key for multiple purposes. It is not theoretically wrong, or based on what we learned, you can use the same shared key for sending messages both ways. But this is in practice how it is structured. Perhaps there are some vulnerabilities under certain circumstances, so we prefer to use different keys for both ways of encryption. MB here is the session MAC key for data sent from Bob to Alice. So if now Bob wants to provide authentication, message authentication, then this is what he will send. He will send the hash of the message concatenated with K of MB. And if you want to add liveliness, you can also add the timestamp here into each of your message authentication codes. And MA is the same thing for Alice, for sending messages with message authentication property. This is what Alice will send. Hash of M concatenated with K of MA. Again, it's the same principle. We don't want to use the same key for both ways of transmission, so we allocated keys for them. And if let's say they want to add both encryption, both confidentiality and message authentication properties, then they can do both. For instance, Bob can send KEB of M for encrypted message, and then he can also send HM and KMB. So let's say Alice received it. What does she do? Let's use a different color here. First thing Alice does is decrypting this to obtain the M. And then she will add KMB to M and see if this digest is equivalent to this digest, or this message authentication code is equivalent to this message authentication code. And if that is correct, she will verify and she will establish that this message is authentic, it is coming from Bob, and that we know that no one else can derive any function out of the message. In other words, we have the confidentiality property. Or, typically, this is one way, but in other words, we can also append the MAC and encrypt. Yeah, it's actually the same process I just described, So let's say this is your message, right? You append the MAC like this, and then you can encrypt this whole thing. This is the typical approach. It's not what I described, but that also works. So this is the typical approach how it's done. So we first compute the MAC, and then we encrypt. And then when Alice receives this, let's say Alice receives this, she can decrypt it so that she has the MAC and the message, and from there she will just verify the message authentication code. She will verify this. All right, any questions? Okay. So this is a joke I like. So if you delve too deep into the mathematics and the cryptography of security, this is what might happen to you. So here's a crypto nerd, and the imagination is that, oh no, this laptop is encrypted, let's build $1 million cluster to crack it. And the other guy says, no good, it's 4096-bit RSA. 4096 is a very long RSA key bit size. Typically, it is usually 3000 or so. And then, oh no, our evil plan is foiled. We cannot do anything because it apparently takes billions of years with today's computers to crack that RSA code. But what would happen typically is that if that laptop is encrypted, let's just drag the guy and hit him with this $5 wrench, and until he tells us the password. So this in fact reflects the typical approach to security. All the practices that we have, if properly employed, they are amazingly good. If you employ transport layer security in your web server, there is no way your password will be cracked with today's computers. Yes, maybe in NSA or something, in some government agency in the US or in Russia, maybe if they really want to decipher your emails, they can spend years with their supercomputers or maybe quantum computers if they have. They can, yes, crack your code if they want, perhaps. But that is not usually the risk we have. It is usually the ignorance and failure to implement good practices. So let's say we have a very secure bank website. It can be any of the banks in Singapore. And you're accessing your bank website with your password. And you also have a two-factor authentication so that when you're making important transactions, it asks you to respond to a prompt on your mobile phone, right? So that is perfectly secure. I mean, they use digital signatures, they use transport layer security, and on top of that, in case you leave your computer open somewhere, or in case you lose your password somehow, you still have that two-factor authentication. But the main problem in that case is your negligence. So you might get too excited sometimes. Maybe a Nigerian prince emailed you and he wants to send you $1 million. Or maybe your aunt that you don't know left you a large inheritance. And when that happens and you get excited, they will typically ask you to send money first so that you can get that huge inheritance from the prince or the aunt. You might send that amount to a bank account voluntarily. Or in an organization, even if you have all these security applications running, you have web servers running with powerful security, if you respond to the phishing emails, if you click on the links in the phishing emails, you may be sent to a malicious website, which then perhaps infects your computers after you download some stuff, or which just replicates a well-known website. So the whole website looks like the same. It's called a phishing attack. Maybe it looks like your bank account, and then you click on all the links. You make transactions on your bank account, and while you are making those, perhaps you're sending money to your own account, to another account of yours. You think you are doing that on your own bank account's website, but at the same time, the attackers are getting your password, the password you entered to that phishing website, and they are using that to access your real account. And once you are prompted with the two-factor authentication, perhaps you do not read carefully what's written there, and you immediately click on yes, I approve, and that approves not the transaction that you think you are making, but it approves the transactions that your attackers are making. So a lot of the vulnerabilities we have occur from negligence and ignorance of humans rather than the lack of the unproven security or the lack of bit security in the cryptographic primitives that we learn. And similar to this example, if you just leave your laptop open somewhere, or if someone just hits you with the wrench, there is not much you can do about that. So the lesson out of this is, just stay safe, always suspect stuff, and don't fall for scams. Yeah, okay. And the cryptography is not the only approach we have for security. We have other things like firewalls, intrusion detection systems, or security policies. They do not typically use cryptographic primitives that we learned, but they use a much simpler, simplistic version of security. Although sometimes they can be complex, yes. But typically, firewalls, if you're talking about firewalls, they are very simple rules. So it typically isolates an organization's internal network from larger internet. And unfortunately, this is typically used for this, yes, but it is also used to protect the individuals inside the network from outside. So they can ban gaming, for instance, in certain networks. They can just ban through the firewalls for all the packets going to a gaming servers or maybe some harmful servers with obscene stuff. So it typically allows some packets to pass and blocks others. It is for the higher layers, usually the network layer and the transport layer of the messages. So let's say this is an organization here on the left, and on the right we have the public internet. So we have all the trusted guys, all the good guys inside. We trust all the computers there, all the servers there, so that we only want to process commands that come from any of the hosts inside. So this firewall, if from a public internet, if someone sends a harmful message from an IP address or using credentials that our users don't have, and using credentials other than our users, then it will simply be blocked by the firewall. Or maybe it doesn't just block all the packets that are coming from unknown users, but it may be arranged to block only certain web servers that are known to be harmful. And there are some benefits to deploying firewalls. For instance, in the denial of service attack, you keep sending requests to a web server, and then that web server is flooded with these requests, and they won't be able to respond to other legitimate users. And one example of that is the SYN flooding. They just send a TCP connection request with the TCP SYN requests. And if there are too many of them coming from multiple devices repeatedly, there may be no resources left for the real connections. So if your server knows these attackers' IP addresses, or if it can detect the IP addresses of these attackers, using a firewall, you can block them. It can prevent illegal modifications or access of internal data. So some data has to stay within an organization. It has to be confidential. For instance, let's say you are running a public transport system, or let's say you're running a healthcare system, you're a hospital, and you have your patient's data recorded in your internal servers, and you do not want anyone outside to access that. You can set your firewall to block all the large files going outside of your organization. Or you can just block any files with a certain format going outside your organization. Or you can block some IP addresses to send information, perhaps other than your higher level management. You don't allow your hosts within your organization to send data outside of your organization. One other use case is you can only allow authorized access inside your network. For instance, you can assign a username passwords for all of your users. And only when that username password is provided, you let them access to your organization, perhaps using VPN. So firewalls typically operate on the TCP IP headers, the network layer and the transport layer. And it doesn't check the lower layers, it doesn't check the data itself, or it doesn't check correlation among the sessions. So what do we mean by that? Maybe let's go over this example. Against that, we have intrusion detection systems. So these do certain statistical checks, looks at the correlations of different packets and different hosts, rather than checking each packet individually on its own. They can run more complicated algorithms, perhaps using machine learning, to block malicious activity. There are different types of IDSs, but very generally, you attach these IDSs to certain key points in your internal network, and they check how many packets each IP is sending, what kind of messages they are sending, what kind of commands they are giving. Can these commands be harmful? Do they make sense? Or you can look at the packets, the actual data in the packets, and you can, for instance, check certain character strings if they look anything like a malware. Or let's say all the computers in your system needs to be updated. And when they're updating, you can check if they are in fact updating the correct Windows update, or are they downloading some bogus update, the malware. So you can think of this as a more improved version of the firewalls, with not only per packet rules, but something that can look at the correlations, the statistical relations between different packets. And we usually install these into large organizations or large OT networks, operational technology networks, like power plants in the MRT system of Singapore, in the water treatment plants, or important factories, these key factories that cannot tolerate any attacks, so that these things not only check whether a packet is coming from a harmful IP address, and they also check if this command is executed, can anything go wrong? These kinds of checks. Okay, any questions? Okay, so this concludes our lectures. Your study of network protocols and applications is now complete. Never mind this. This is from earlier year. So your final exam is, I think the last time I checked, it's on the 4th of May at 9 a.m., but please check it again. Don't rely me on this. It will be in a physical venue, no online exams. You'll be allowed to bring one A4 size cheat sheet, and it will be closed book. And the questions will be largely similar to tutorial format. So there will be some easy questions, there will be some more difficult questions. Some questions will require short answers, maybe explaining a concept. But most of the questions will be like tutorial questions involving problems to solve. Well, I can say that it doesn't question you very deeply into the very details of all these protocols. I recognize that we learned too many protocols here, but most of them is for just developing a general understanding of how networks operate, how applications can work, how we can support all these applications today with security, with the throughput requirements and delay requirements they have. Yeah, so don't worry too much about every detail of the protocols. If you develop a general understanding of the things, why things work this way but no other type of understanding, I think you'll be fine. Most questions will be like tutorial questions, so you can just practice a little bit of these tutorial questions, and it will depend a little bit on your problem-solving ability, some analytical abilities, but I would say not much memorization. So I don't think you need to write everything in your cheat sheet, just some generic stuff it will be helpful enough. Yeah, any questions? Okay, so we finished with our material, but in the next lecture I'll be solving the last tutorial problems, and then, sorry about that. So after solving the tutorial problems, I'll do something like an office hour, because I don't have an office in the US, so you cannot visit me for questions. So you can ask me to revise any concept, any slide that you didn't understand. You can ask me any question about the parts that I taught here. And you can also ask me to solve certain parts of the tutorial problems, so that kind of thing. Or if let's say you attempted to solve a different problem on your own, but you couldn't do it, you can just walk through the steps that you have done and ask me to point to your error or just help you with solving the problem. So it will be more, it won't be like a lecture after I solve the last tutorial questions. So you can just come down and ask me, and the rest can listen, or they can just leave or just work on your own, up to you. I'm not sure if I can turn off the video, but I can just turn off the sound. So it won't be recorded. It will be only here. At least the sound won't be recorded. I'm not sure about the video. So you can be more relaxed. You won't be recorded. And you can just ask anything you want. Okay? Any questions? Okay. Then see you on Friday.